The next speaker I'd like to introduce, Scott Horst, is a Senior Vice President with the U.S. Green Building Council and is responsible for the LEED rating scheme. And we're very happy to have him here because I think the U.S. GBC, both personally for myself and I think for many green building councils around the world, is a great story of a lot of, so from the early days when it's very difficult to really the transformative things that they've done. So with that, Scott, I'd like to look forward to your comments here.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, esteemed colleagues and fellow green building professionals. I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion about where LEED fits, why I'm here. I can tell you I'm here because Rick Fedrizzi isn't here. He is our CEO who was scheduled to speak, and I have the distinction of following him around and picking up when he is ill. He was coming back from China and was poisoned with E. coli and was very ill, so I feel fortunate to stand in here. And how appropriate that we're in this room of the Academy of Sciences, where you can just imagine some of the big things that have been thought and dealt with over time. You can almost imagine at some time in history where something like, let's say, the theory of relativity was introduced for the first time to a number of people probably in this very room in this country. Not that it was introduced in this country, but the first time it was introduced in this country, it may well have been in this room. And how fascinating that that idea in itself all of a sudden shifted something so big, something so gigantic that all of a sudden the world changed. What I want to talk about is what are the things that we are doing and what is the way that we can do it together. I want to focus on the word together, that allow for that type of shift. So what I saw, I really appreciate Jerry's presentation, because Jerry's presentation is an example of a very successful tactic that we have used in the United States to motivate people to buy stuff to do green things. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about. But I want to spend more time talking about the big shift that we need to see happen and how we do that together. So let me mention this together idea. I started out in Paris on this trip, and then Italy, and now here. In Paris, I have the distinction of meeting fairly often now with Alfonso Pons, who is with he's with CSTB, the French government's building research arm, and have met with Paul King, Jane Henley, a number of other people in this room who have been working on common metrics. So largely because of the CEN work at the EU that you all may know about. How many of you are aware of the CEN TC 350? Okay, the people I'm working with. This CEN work is about alignment of the rating systems. And I feel fortunate that we've been able to be pulled into that work through an organization called Sustainable Building Alliance that now is looking at an arrangement or a memorandum of understanding with the World Green Building Council and the United Nations Environment Program, the Sustainable Buildings Climate Initiative, in order to find ways to see how these rating systems measure things that are similar. So where we're starting is with a framework of carbon, and the framework is the life cycle of a building, and we've agreed to start with one little part of this, and what we plan on doing is measuring or piloting how that measurement will show in the different rating systems. So when you say carbon, we say the same carbon. And that's going to be very interesting. The DG&B people have been very influential, by the way, in all this work. Eva Schmenk has been a true technical leader in how a lot of this work is happening. So I'm only mentioning this because, again, the word together is really important. What I want to talk a bit about today is what I think are our strengths in the U.S. Because even though, to your question, which is a very good one, even though we have very bad collective practices in the US and we have the highest carbon footprint per capita, we also have a very vigorous green building movement that is growing significantly without the help of the federal government. So we've had to come up with something that, especially during the Bush administration, I did not have the support that you have from your governments. We did not have the Energy Buildings Performance Directive that you have. But what we do have is something that, through techniques like what Jerry was using, is an ability to motivate people to improve. And I disagree with Jerry about one thing. Improvement, from my perspective, is the key to our success. I want to talk a little bit about that as we go on. So let me just use this idea of relativity being introduced and talk for a moment about a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In this book, Kuhn lays out how big shifts happen, and he introduces to us for the first time in our history the idea of paradigm shifts. It's become a very well-worn and used term, but Kuhn introduces it this way. He talks about the difference between normal science and then revolutionary science. And normal science is the science in the field. It's the science in the laboratories where you're with the microscope and you're looking at things all day long, and there's a lot of competition and fighting over what's happening. And then through leadership, someone like an Einstein takes that information, all that collected information over time, and turns it and shifts it and turns all of that knowledge on its head to a whole new place. And then a new type of normal science occurs. So what I suggest is that the issues of competition, the issues of this rating system or that rating system, or this tool versus that tool, those are normal science issues for us, using that analogy. And what we collectively need to do is create the leadership and work together to find some way to get to this next big shift. We can look outside and see how challenging our job is. It's an extremely challenging job. This will not change as we look outside anywhere in the world. It will not change without a large, large shift. So, let me talk about this type of shift. I grew up in Minnesota. I was born in a town called Northfield. It's a small town in southern Minnesota, which is in the middle northern part of the United States. It's very cold and there's very little culture. There's not a single room like this anyplace. And there was a man who studied there with Frank Lloyd Wright that I got to know as a young man. Frank Lloyd Wright had a school called Taliesin. And at this school, what designers and architects would do, they would work all day, they would build materials, they'd put the buildings together, and then they would draw at night, and once a week they'd get to sit down and talk with Frank Lloyd Wright. So the gentleman I got to know, he was not an architect, which I think is an interesting signal of Frank Lloyd Wright and how he was not going to confine good ideas based on what schools were telling people was possible. So this is a designer working with Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright sits down with him once a week and he says one thing to him the entire summer. This gentleman is at Taliesin. He says, "The way you look at the world will determine the design of your smallest closet." The way you look at the world will determine the design of your smallest closet. So we can certainly see how people looked at the world that designed this building, right? They looked at it as a representation of the greatness of the culture. And you can see in really cheap buildings how people look at the world. They look at it relative to the bottom line only. The way I look at the world is, how do we take human systems, big systems, things like capitalism, communism, big, huge ideas, things that run society, how do we take those systems and integrate them with natural systems? Let me give some ideas on this. I believe the answer is in how we integrate our work into the economy. That's one very important answer. So I was at a conference at the Swedish Embassy just before the COP15 conference in Copenhagen, and a British diplomat there named John Ashton was talking, and he was giving a very good talk, and the room was filled with top-of-the-line Washington, D.C. environmental nonprofits. And there was the Natural Resources Defense Council there, the Environmental Defense Group, the World Wildlife Foundation, the U.S. Green Building Council. And John Ashton says, how many of you work for environmental nonprofits? And we all raised our hands very vigorously, thinking just before COP, we are the ones that are going to save the day. And he says, he turns to us and he goes, you are not doing your job. He said, you and your little environmental issues. If you are not in the economy, you are irrelevant. Now, this struck me because, first of all, I kind of sheepishly put my hand back down. But I was thinking, what we do, what we collectively are about, is creating a purchasing tool, creating a purchasing movement that is about adding a different type of value to the economy. So I used to smoke cigarettes. And it was a friend of mine in Italy that saw me as I was doing more green building work, smoking more cigarettes, getting more nervous, thinking, how can I change the world more? And he says, Scott, the cigarettes are now smoking you. You are no longer smoking the cigarettes. Now, this analogy makes a lot of sense to me because, see, we have these big systems that smoke us, they guide us, they run our lives. Our job as citizens and as green building professionals is to turn that around so we are driving the economy. The economy is not here to run us. We are here to run the economy. It is our tool to help us become better people. It is our tool to help us become a greater society. It is our tool to help us engage in life in a different way. So how does that work? Essentially, the way LEED was formed was a group of people knew that they had a lot of power as designers. They knew that they could determine what types of materials a building was built out of, at least have a big impact in it. They knew that they could determine how you could integrate the size of systems with the envelope of the structure, so that if you beefed up the envelope of the structure, you could downsize the systems. They knew that if they talked together in a different way, they could come up with a type of structure that functioned in a much more integrative fashion, such that it was a whole building, not just a sum of a whole variety of parts that then did not function well together. And what they did was, they came up with ideas, which we call credits. They put requirements on those credits, which were very specific, so people knew how they needed to get to a certain place, and they started buying. They started guiding purchasing based on these environmental ideas. And what happened was, companies started noticing that they were losing jobs because of a credit in a rating system. And companies started changing their practices in order to better align with that credit in a rating system. And all of a sudden, just this very simple idea of saying, we want to buy things that integrate the environment with the economy better, turned into actually starting to shift a larger sense of the economy, to the extent that right now, even though we are still at a small portion of all buildings in the United States, we are certifying, this statistic I love, well, we have 30,000 projects. Jerry's information was a little bit old. 30,000 registered projects in 114 different countries. That part is not significant, other than that 1/3 of all that square footage is in other countries outside the US. And we are today certifying 100,000 square meters every day. 100,000 square meters every day since January 1, 2010. That, to me, is the nature of market transformation. It's starting to show that a big shift is happening. So what does it mean if you're just a new Green Building Council? What does it mean if you're just beginning at the very early stages? And how do you use some of the information that we learned over the past 10 years? Other than just, the point is that it's not about LEED. Actually, let me talk about that for a minute before kind of going to this idea of how to engage as green building councils. I used to have a wood shop. So I began my career, I went to music school, and then as that led through life, I started a wood shop. And because singing opera is not a great way to have a family. The way to have an opera career basically is to come sing in Germany. And that's what I did for a while, but then sang around the United States. I started a wood shop, and what I learned in the wood shop is that tools have a very unique function. And that every time you want to make something with a tool, you either let that tool determine what it is that you're making, or you decide what you're going to make and you choose the tools that you want to use. Okay, so if you have, let's say the center of every shop is a table saw. If that's your only tool, you'll only make boxes, right? You'll cut straight lines. You might be able to make some interesting templates to do some sort of curves, but you will cut straight lines and make boxes. If you have a chisel and a hammer, everything changes, right? Because then all of a sudden you can actually start cutting things and putting them together in different ways. If you have hand saws and hand tools, they start to shift. And what's really fascinating is that tools like, let's say, a handsaw that comes from Germany and is now used in the US is all about pushing, whereas handsaws from Japan are about pulling. The handsaw in Japan pulls in order to cut the wood. My point is that every tool has a different reason. And there's a huge variety, there's a huge amount of overlap between the different tools that we see. BREEAM was there first, and there's a lot of wealth and amazing information that we get from BREEAM. DG&B is incredibly sophisticated from what I understand about it now and have seen about it. CASB, if any of you have seen CASB, is an outrageously sophisticated and beautiful tool coming from Japan. HQE in France, very interesting tool relative to local issues. What LEED represents right now is something Jerry was talking about, which is a brand for a brand. It's a brand, and it's largely used by corporations to very easily say to their clientele and to people that are purchasing, we care. We are involved with this environmental movement, and you can tell because we do LEED in our buildings. That's one of the reasons that LEED has grown. So the reason I say this is because it's important as any growing green building council to look at nature. Now what nature does is nature changes one of two ways. Nature changes either through catastrophe, earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, big disasters, and then it changes. Or it changes through evolution. Now, evolution is very interesting because evolution is the constant gauging of interests. It's the constant discussion in nature among itself about how to negotiate mutations that shift and then allow for something to grow. So growing very slowly and evolving is the key to how to grow a green building council. That's how nature grows. And our job is to essentially grow and evolve very slowly so that future generations are not faced with the catastrophe that we are potentially handing them through our current actions. So I think what I'd like to do actually is stop for a moment and see if anyone has questions, and also ask some of my other colleagues to provide some insights as to what they have learned by doing their Green Building Council work. I can go on, I'll come back and give you some details of where we were early on and how some of the pain changed. And I want to give you some sort of key principles that I believe have been really useful for us. But let me turn, let's say, to Paul King and see if Paul has anything that he wants to share about how to grow a Green Building Council, because it's an excellent example of a Green Building Council that has just burgeoned and really fantastically grown.
I'm fascinated by the way that you've described the different emphasis on evolution and revolutionary change. It's something that preoccupies me a lot in the UK. It's something that's preoccupying me right now as we are gearing up for a general election in a few weeks' time. Because unlike the US and Australia and some of the other markets where we've seen a growing green building revolution that has been primarily driven from the market, not by national governments, in the UK, the national government policy and regulatory environment has had a huge impact. And as we look at the various manifestos of the different leading parties in the UK vying for position and seeking to form the next government in a few weeks' time, it's very interesting to kind of read between the lines and look for the hints about where they might go on this agenda. Clearly, this agenda may not be the very top of their list right now, but it's quite interesting to look at the relationship between the issues that we're concerned with those big issues of economy, social equity, and other things that are at the top of their list. And I think what that says to me is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, that every Green Building Council has got to listen and learn, and we can all learn a lot from one another in these different experiences. And then we have to be quite careful, and we have to think through the timing of those different approaches in our different environments. When the US Green Building Council was born, 17 years ago or so, I'm guessing it was pretty much the only green show in town in terms of the built environment. When the UK Green Building Council was born 3 years ago, it was everything but. We were just the latest kid on a very, very crowded block, and had to try to find our way in all of that. And the way in which it became important for us to find our way was to actually add some value precisely because of that overcrowded marketplace, to try and be a catalyst to bring about some cohesion, some leadership, to allow people who are trying to understand and trying to do the right thing to be able to see the wood for the trees. And that's what we've sought to do. So I think, you know, every Green Building Council, every company and every market needs to evaluate what is the right thing to do in that given situation. But the more that we learn from one another, the more we share, the more we can speed up the extent to which we can all bring about a transformational change, not just an incremental change.
Yeah, that's good. So thanks, Paul. So the word you said, adding value, is really significant. There's something that you're bringing to the table that isn't there before, and it's consistent with value and values. That we aren't just, it's not just currency. What we're about as an entire movement is adding value in a whole variety of different ways. Could I ask, who's here from DG&B? Would you mind telling us some of your experience with, briefly even, and I know we have updates this afternoon, but I'd be very interested in hearing how it's been for you to start a Green Building Council in the context of being a leader already. Everyone knows Germany has a variety of very high-performing buildings and the ability to engineer fantastic buildings. What has it been like to create a council in that environment?
As far as I see, the problem always was that the Germans had a very, well, everyone knew that the Germans have a lot of skills in this, on the environmental building, but we didn't have any system. Everybody said, well, you know, you do a lot of good things, but we cannot rate it with the usual rating systems, which we had. So so why don't you do an own rating system, which is more like German, with all that stuff, which is not only environmental stuff, but also like a lot of social and functional things in it. So we started making this together, and we had a lot of support, and that's very important. We had a lot of support from the German Ministry for Transport and Public Building. And together with them, we invented a system, and then we came up, I mean, this was really like the investors came to us, and the investors came to the German architects saying, well, you're famous for your engineering skills, but you don't have any system, you don't have a council. So we had to do it, and we had the pressure to do it, and we came up with all that really support from the ministry, and that made it for us quite easy to bring this up in now 1.5 years to a system, to like 900 members in the German Green Building Council. So we are growing quite fast.
So the very interesting thing there that you said to me was one of the key issues that made LEED take off as well, which was in the late 90s, there were a lot of people doing a lot of really interesting things, a lot of very interested people in trying to do better things, and there was no way to define it. So someone would put some solar on a building and they would call it a green building. It wasn't even green at that point. Everyone would say an environmental building. Someone would do some interesting stormwater management design processes, and they'd say that was an environmental design building. And it was a group of people that came together in the United States to create LEED that basically said, we want to come up with a series of different ideas and with prerequisites, things that you have to do. And if you do so many of them, we'll call it a green building. If you do more, we'll call it a silver building, and more a gold building, and even more a platinum building. So what LEED provided, and what I hear you're providing, is a definition of what it means to build a green building. And that in itself becomes the fulcrum with which we can start to change the economy, the definition. But the interesting thing is, again, LEED is not the only way to define a green building. This is a very important thing you're saying, that Germans came to you to say, we need a German way of defining it. Alfonso, would you mind saying a little bit about your issues? And I won't be able to go to all the councils. I'm going to people I know and that I work with.
Thank you, Scott. I'm in a funny position because I represent the French government. I work for CSTB, the French Building Research Center. We created, just months after BRE, our counterpart in the UK, created BREEAM in the end of the 80s. We created HQE, which stands for High Environmental Quality. And a year after that, we created an association, which is actually, could be a Green Building Council, but was run by government and excluded the private sector. And some of the things I like of what Scott said is that LEED is not just a certification tool, it's not just an eco-label, it is a movement, and that is something we didn't get to make happen. So that is why also we are very happy to create this GBC in France and be part of this family. We're looking with great interest of what the model of the UK Green Building Council too, because what our ultimate goal is not just a technical goal. It is more the goal we have is to create a movement and transform the market. And we know that is not something that you can do if you work only with your similars. You have to have a public-private partnership. You have to have academics, you have to have engineers, you have to have PRs, you have to have politicians, you have to have policymakers, you have to have a cross-sector cooperation model.
In other words, what we see in this room is what we see in this room is a group of leaders, because there's probably, I would suspect at least half the room is people with similar types of experience in your own country doing your own work, And what we need to do is make sure that there's a way that we are working together, no matter how we're competing in our natural science, that we're working together in order to do a larger shift. So I was at a forum in New York City for the World Economic Forum. The question is that I have is it working? Is it making any difference? Because I could give you numbers all day about how many buildings are doing what and how much is being lowered and all this stuff, but we know the problem is still getting worse, right? You know when you look outside, it's still getting worse. So we were at this forum, and there are a bunch of environmental leaders there in the morning, big names, talking about big changes and all the things that they have done to create those changes. And it was a very interesting discussion about how to create these changes. And then we had a lunch break. And then in the afternoon, the real people come in the room, the economists. And they were impeccable. They were like amazing soldiers. They were incredibly polished. They looked like they had stayed in the best places everywhere. Their fingernails were perfect. They were just absolutely, to the nth degree, almost beyond human. And they're standing there telling us how the economy is shifting and what we can expect in the housing market, and housing starts are going to be at this %, and we should expect to get to here by a certain time. And you could see that they were the most evolved palm readers in the world. They were predicting the future so people could dump big, huge amounts of money in that direction and hope for the best. So I asked one of these people, who was the chief economist at Goldman Sachs, I said, so what does the morning have to do with the afternoon? Is sustainability connected to this discussion you're having about the economy? And she goes, I'm sorry, honey, you are not even on my radar. You are not even a blip on my radar screen. But then the second economist says, yes, that's true. But every time there's a downturn in the economy, we see that almost 70% of the activity after the downturn did not exist before the downturn. So he says all signs, if you're looking closely, all signs are showing that the new economy is a green economy, and that most decision-making about products, processes, tools, things that we build, and how we grow the economy will have something to do with the environment in some way. So I will go, whew, yes, I think he's right. Even to the extent where someone said in Paris the other day, which was very profound to me, it's like a CEO ignoring the future of the sustainable economy today is like a CEO in 1995 ignoring the internet. It was there. There were small groups of people meeting in interesting spaces talking about what the internet might become. I know I bought a computer right around then, but I remember thinking, email, who needs email? That's silly. You know, I don't need email. That's some new fad. It'll go away. And I live on email now. I mean, I literally live on it. I imagine you probably have similar stories to the difference between that time and today. That's the kind of shift that we need to talk about relative to the economy. So our tools need to do several things. Our tools need to measure, but there's one thing I want to say about measurement. Measurement, one of the sayings goes, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But this idea of management is precisely the problem that got us in the trouble we're in today. We cannot manage nature. What we need to do is have a relationship with nature. And through that relationship, create constant small changes. Now, what does it mean to measure? And what do we want to get out of that measurement? What we want to get is engagement. There's a whole new movement. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times recently about a new movement in psychology that's focusing on happiness and the connection to nature. That your unhappiness, or if you are unhappy, it is industrialized. The approach to how you could get happy is even industrialized in the answers that you can receive about your happiness and fixing your mind. What they're saying is, you can't fix it. there's a connection to nature that is missing, and that's what we need to focus on. But what's fascinating about this movement was that they're really blown away, and they're spending a lot of time trying to figure out psychologically, if you know that something is wrong, why wouldn't you act to fix it? So if you know that climate change is happening, why do we do nothing? Our tools are the answer to that. Our tools are about engaging people in everyday decision-making, small, little decisions guided by credits that we have in our rating systems that help people decide, oh, I've been doing this thing. This credit is telling me that this thing is something good that I've been doing. I'm going to do more of that. And then it tells you that, oh, if I reduce my water consumption, I will also reduce other costs down the line. Or if I collect rainwater, I can reduce my water costs and also change the flush and flow rates that will reduce my water consumption. And that has a cost impact. And Jerry gave all the great examples for what those cost issues are. But it's engagement that we give, that our tools need to give. And that engagement leads to something that is unique, leadership. You in this room, you are here because you are leaders. I suspect, I almost guarantee, next time you have this meeting or a similar meeting, you will not be able to meet in this room because it will be so big. And it will be because you will have gone out and talked to people and told them how exciting it is to actually engage in your life, to connect and have a relationship with nature through everyday decision-making based on credits in rating systems. That is what we call transformation. And transformation is not a little teeny thing. Transformation, the actual word means to totally change. It doesn't mean to tweak here and there, make something a little bit better. It doesn't mean to, try to reduce something here and there. We get to transformation by reduction, but transformation is this much larger shift, this thing that we have to see happening. So let me finish with a poem. And it's one of my favorite poems by Pablo Neruda. And it's just the very end of this poem. He wrote it, it's called Now We Will Count to 12. And he wrote it just after the Allende government that he had been very involved with was overthrown. It's called Now We Will Count to 12, and supposedly he died 12 days later of heart disease. This is just an example of how connected you can be, with your own biology. He's such a, if you look at his writing, it's so connected to nature. He says, if we were not so single-minded about our lives always moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us, as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So look out there in any city in the world, and you will see the end of winter. You'll see death. You'll see too much carbon. You'll see too much of everything. You'll see something that doesn't seem like it can possibly change. And then imagine a field at the end of winter with all the thatch having been pushed down by the snow and just brown death everywhere. And you get closer and you see little springs of grass poking up underneath through that thatch. That's us. That's us. We are the spring. We are the new life. And the earth can teach us. Thank you very much.
Well, Scott, I can only say thank God a coffee break follows your speech. Because I wouldn't want to be the next. And I have to say, after all the energy my Green Building Council colleagues have put into this, and it's I think, a very exhausting period. for myself, you've really recharged my energy alone, and I'm sure for many of the others here. So I want to say thank you for that. We will open the floor for questions.
So let me ask the question back to the gentleman about, if you don't mind, I'd be interested in what was your feeling as I was talking about whether or not it feels like we're exporting information that seems to perhaps be absurd. I think you raised a very valid point. How do we work together in a competitive environment in order to create this bigger shift, instead of how do I come here and make sure everyone does LEED, right? And so maybe there's not a question that I have for you, but it's, I simply want us all to be thinking, as you are growing your councils, how do we use the collective amount of knowledge that we have? We're the levers to the market. We want to be the ones that help create the change by helping people do.
There is a lot of value in sharing. That's the main reason why I'm here. I think one needs to look more carefully at the circumstances. I think that the economists you talked to should also have talked about externalities. They should also have talked about free riding behavior. They should also have talked about prisoners' dilemmas. I think these are things, as an economist myself, these are very, very important things. I think that the green building movement, green building councils are a way to overcome some of those prisoners' dilemmas. And rating systems are there to overcome an information deficit that is in the market. So I think these are some of those aspects. Another, you kind of asked me for a reflection. Well, one other reflection was that our American colleagues are excellent in marketing. And another reflection is that there is a great tradition of preaching in the US. You can look at the president, he has learned. You can look at many other examples. I think we just heard one. Great preaching.
My father was a preacher, so yeah.
You learn.
Yeah. Thank you.
The first question, do you have any statistics of how many or what proportion of industry activists are using green techniques? I know that's very difficult given that it's a worldwide organization. That's the first question. And the second question is it not a problem that developers say that their buildings are green as a selling point, so it becomes a brand like green restaurants and so on, and doesn't that blur the waters somewhat?
Yeah, two really good questions. One is we track the buildings by sector in the United States and our influence on that sector. All I know is from the commercial construction market, we're about 7% of the commercial construction market. Of the overall building market, it's very small. I mean, we've got a long way to go. So no matter how big LEED seems, there's a lot of work to do. In the schools sector, we are at almost 30%. So there's a very large uptake in schools and higher education. And I can get you numbers on the other sectors. I just would have to get someone from my staff to send you the spreadsheet. I don't keep that stuff in my head. The second question, what was the second question? Do you remember?
Green buildings.
Oh, yeah.
Becoming a brand or just a selling point.
Right. Well, to me, that's the value of certification. And one thing I know, so I had a consulting business before coming to U.S. Green Building Council, and one thing I know, we did a lot of LEED work. One thing I know is that every LEED project I walked in on, they thought they were doing everything already. And what the rating systems do for project teams is help them understand the reality of the specifics of what they really need to accomplish in order to achieve credits. So LEED, or I'm sorry, all the rating systems that certify are very good at sort of holding the feet to the fire of the project teams to make sure that they really get to the place that they think they are already. It's like, from a performance perspective, it's the difference between practicing. You know, it's like you have to sit there and practice and practice and practice. Certification makes you practice, and ultimately the certification plaque is the kind of the performance, the final moment. We've started something at U.S. Green Building Council called the Building Performance Initiative, which takes performance to a whole nother level. And that's where we want to be tracking performance of all the buildings over time so we can create a recertification program ultimately. There was one more question, and then I know I'm cutting into the break here, so we'll take one more.
Just one brief question. You mentioned that you came originally to Europe to work on harmonization of the systems. Is there a timeline involved when you guys are going to come out with a common basis for measuring performance?
Jane might be able to answer that question better, and Alfonso, because what I would say is we are likely, hopefully this summer, going to start piloting one small little piece of the carbon metric, and then start to see whether or not we're getting the similar types of results based on how we think we're measuring. But you know, these technical details are very complex. So when I say primary energy, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing when you say primary energy, right? And then we have a big difference between site and source energy, and whether or not we're measuring the same things is going to be very challenging to determine. That's sort of the first step. And I'm hoping by the summer at some point we have a good sense of whether we're on the right track with that. And I think all I can say is, instead of saying we're going to align all the rating systems, I can say what we know we're going to do is start with a small piece of it and see how it works. Why don't I stop so you can all stand up and go get coffee? Thank you very much.